Hi, good afternoon, or should I say good morning, or perhaps I should say good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the AMR Watcher webinar. I have a very interesting subject to talk about, just a little bit about AMR Watcher for those that you don't know who they are. AMR Watcher is a screening tool and a database providing products and services in the AML landscape, and its core features include biometric AML and aims to reduce false positives. Of course, looking at sanctions and all the other good stuff and adverse media. So today we're going to be talking around the subject matter that's in the topic of compliance challenges that have significantly evolved over the last few years when it compares this around the liquor, cannabis and gambling modern landscape, where social media scams, crypto and NFTs have taken a massive surge. There's quite a few stories about that. And it creates a massive challenge for some of the high risk businesses who have to uphold the complexities of the AML industry. So moving on to people who know much more about this than I do, as I'm just the mere host in this, I will welcome my esteemed speakers, firstly up on the stage and in no particular order, but just because his name comes up first, Dwayne King. Dwayne is certified AML expert in Canada, and he leverages his in-depth knowledge to help businesses safeguard their operations and comply with regulations. As a certified expert witness, he has partaken in legal procedures to produce a clear understanding of financial crime issues. He's also the proud recipient of the FinTracks Partnership Award, which is a statement to his dedication to the market. So welcome, Dwayne.
Thanks, great to be here.
And secondly, but not really secondly, in fact, they might go first. Cameron Field. Cameron is award-winning AFC and AML practitioner, and have a career spanning 38 years, in both law enforcement and in the private sector. And today, Cameron brings a wealth of knowledge and insight to this subject matter, which I'm sure we'll be hearing lots more for. So welcome, guys.
Thanks, Mark.
It's a hot topic, and some of the talking points we're going to be talking around today, just to give you a kind of a feel, is around the false negatives and false positives. As I mentioned, how the challenge of RegTech has to evolve and has evolved over the last few years from traditional to modern compliance and all the complexities that go with that. And I suppose, given the fact that you're based in Canada, we're going to focus a little bit on that marketplace a little bit. Sanction evolution and how these markets and global AML data privacy is another point that we're going to be talking around. So to kick off the sort of questions we're going to be talking around, and I'm sure we're aware, and I'll throw this out to both of you, and you can jump on it as you want to jump on it between you. Should social media be officially recognized as a high-risk sector? Well, considering that its role in facilitating payments. Who would like to take the mantle on this?
So I'll start it off, and I think Dwayne and I can both bookend this. Absolutely. Social media has become such an intrinsic part of our life, our daily life, and one could almost say our minute and hourly life, where we're constantly feeding into social media. Social media has become heavily monetized through a variety of different income streams, where people can actually receive and exchange rewards through loyalty programs, and in essence move fiat currency. So just on its own, and because of lack of KYC in social media, where virtually anyone can grab any kind of a platform, there's virtually no transparency. So just off the top, based on how much it is part of our daily lives, it should absolutely be considered as a high-risk sector for banking institutions.
And it creates a challenge, right? Because I agree with Cam, but then I also throw that practical aspect in is, Canadian is very similar to the rest of the world. We want a risk-based approach to our AML programs. And so, we can't take on everything. And yes, I agree, social media, there's the opportunity in theory to launder. And I hope we get into the whole Spotify mess, because I've done some research into that one. That's very interesting. But on the practical perspective, would we love to make everything high risk? Yes, but we don't have the capacity to make everything high risk. So from a risk-based approach, okay, yeah, if you can successfully launder through social media, well, you won that one, right? Because from a practical perspective, how much money is moving through social media compared to trade-based money laundering, for instance. And that's where I wonder if we have the capacity to start to add more to our high-risk list buckets because there's so many already.
Well, I suppose on that note, it's kind of like, well, if you think about the influencers and whether actually instead of the actual social media per se, should it be the actual influencers that we should be looking at too? Are they the high risk individuals? Are they the ones that now you see it quite often that will facilitate and bring in mules as an example? So the question really should be celebrities that are TikTokers that are massive followers suddenly being able to take money in some form or another. Should that be regulated, or should that should be they considered as a high risk?
I would really love, sorry, Cam, to jump in there, but I would really love to understand, what our revenue agencies are doing with that, right? What's their line of sight into it? I know when crypto first came live and people were making millions off crypto, there was no real consideration of whether that money coming in as that crypto profits were actually reportable income, and people were in quotations evading taxes, which is a predicate offense to money laundering because it's fraud against the government. So those big TikTokers, those social media influencers are raking in the millions of dollars a year. How's that translating into income, and how is our revenue agencies? And if the revenue agencies get a handle on it, then I think the financial institutions have to as well. I think that would drive more of my risk appetite. If our revenue agency started to think, okay, I don't like this because people aren't reporting these millions of dollars of income, I think that at that point, financial institutions need to listen a little harder.
I agree with those points. And in terms of just to circle back, Dwayne, you make a really good comment about, we only have so much bandwidth to manage risk within financial institutions. But what if we see, and I think we start to see terrorist financing groups using things like PayPal, eBay, where they're actually moving low amounts of money. They could potentially do that through a social media site to finance such things as terrorism or organized crime. It's a hard thing to do, but how would we regulate that? And that's rhetorical. But obviously, social media platforms, they have billions of people on their books. We could never manage that. But in terms of taking it to the back end of those social media sites, how do they handle their finances? I don't know what the answer is, but as we get better at certain aspects of anti-money laundering, the criminal element will adapt and go to new areas to do it, whether it's gaming platforms or something like that. I think at some point regulators and federal governments are going to say, well, nothing isn't a good response. Like, how do we manage the risk? But most AML teams are at capacity right now. So it's an interesting discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I mentioned to you privately earlier, both of you, I'm currently at the ICA, and when you mentioned the capacity, it just rung a bell in my ear because that seems to be the biggest part. Where do they do the work right now? So, and how do you find this? It's changing beyond control. You mentioned something just now, Dwayne. Last year, some Swedish gang members used Spotify to launder money by buying extra streams from artists and gang affiliations, and then they cashed them out later. How they done that, I'm not privy to how they done that. It seems an extremely complex process. What do you think this impact is and associated to high risk business?
What I think this is a really cool story. I'm going to call it an urban legend, if you will. I've done the research into this when it came out last year. I mean, Spotify denies it's possible, but of course they're going to say that. But what the underlying principle is, Dwayne releases a song. The song sucks, but that's not the point. The gangsters are going to then feed that song a whole bunch of criminal money that I'm going to get then paid for, and then I'm going to pay it back to the gangsters. Right? That's the theory behind it. All this money's going to come in from all these unknown sources through my crappy song on Spotify, and then I'm going to get a monetary reward from Spotify, and then I'm going to give it back to the gangsters. Now, if that, I can't find any proof. It's a good urban legend. It sounds great. I mean, the effort that would go in to laundering through that method is ridiculous. I can open a shell company, find a shell company in the UAE somewhere that's on board with me, and we can launder through trade-based money laundering $1 million a day. So I can't imagine the effort. I mean, it's cool, sounds neat. I don't think the effort makes it a viable money laundering opportunity. And it's definitely not something that I would concern my investigators with to task with the time. They've got enough trade base. They've got enough just straight cash deposits. They've got all the traditional stuff that's still happening. Some of the more nuanced like this, good on them for figuring that out.
But do you think that is a gateway into something else? Do you think that, you know, we might have heard this story and both gone, really? How? What? How? And then do you think that actually, you know, back to our question before about the influencers and about how they're generating cash, you know, do you think this could be a gateway into it? I think is the point. That suddenly it becomes more sophisticated.
I think potentially it could, if I can chime in here. You know, just on its face, if we're to be believed, like obviously Swedish gang members are using money right off the bat. That money is proceeds of crime. I mean, whether they're selling drugs, trafficking people, or whatever. And that, to Dwayne's point, this is a very complex way of laundering money. Logistically, it's a nightmare. But you know, utilizing musicians that have gang affiliations. I mean, Brian, to your point, you know, they're starting to influence customers and they're moving money around the same way. I mean, conceivably, you could hatch something like this on YouTube if you were so inclined. And, you know, I know Dwayne's experience, it's the same. We've seen people that launder money start to shy away from mainstream banks as they start to kind of target harden their banks to money laundering. So they go to perhaps credit unions or other money service businesses. They're always looking for a different avenue, and they're quite agile. They will look at non-traditional ways of laundering money to see if it does work. So yeah, and that's our problem in the anti-money laundering space. They're constantly probing defenses to see where they can get rid of money.
Yeah. So I suppose it's being alert to that. It's being, you know, when you described it, Dwayne, you know, it was I'm sure you used your own name in that sense. I'm sure you're an absolutely fantastic singer and artist. I'm sure you could be, but to that point, you know, if we both, all of us now looked at and heard an absolute rubbish song, and you suddenly realised how many hits, really, why, what, you know, there could be a questioning to that point, I suppose.
And Spotify will tell you they have algorithms and checks and balances in place to make sure that doesn't happen. Of course, you know, whether that's valid, I have no reason to not believe Spotify has the capability of doing that. Whether they're truly executing on it, who knows? But when we talk about, you know, this will be the last thing because we've got a bunch of stuff we want to cover. But you know, we talk about these really cool ideas because they're fun to chat with. Yeah. But we still haven't shut the door on large cash deposits and laundering through cash. You know, in Canada last year, we printed more $100 bills than we did the year before. Yet, according to the last How Do You Pay survey, and I know when I talk about a How Do You Pay survey, I'm an AML geek and I get that screams out there. But when you talk about the How Do You Pay survey, it's less than $20 Canadian is the average price at which we stop using cash and move to debit or credit. But we're printing more hundreds. Why? Where's it going? It's going offshore. It's being bulk cash smuggled and then repatriated into foreign banks. We haven't figured that out yet. But it's fun to talk about the cool stuff like laundering through Spotify. Yeah,
and that is a global problem, of course. You know, that's not just from a Canadian point of view. But
and I just want to chime here. Speaking of global problems, I do have to say, and I've heard it, Dwayne is an exceptionally good singer. But a problem like this, if we're successful, would be an absolute nightmare for anti-money laundering teams. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So let's move away from Dwayne's dulcet tones of singing us to sleep, and I mean that in the nicest possible way. Let's have a conversation around cannabis. Of course, you know, Canada is one of the countries that's now legal in. There's a notification out by FinTrack in 2022. How do you think this impacts high-risk businesses in Canada?
So I'll start off this one as well. Obviously, marijuana was legalized in Canada some time ago and created a market and industry for commercial interest to start up grow ops across Canada. There was some, speaking diplomatically, there was issues of execution of how this regime would kind of develop across Canada, where companies would legally obtain certification from Health Canada and all the other regulatory issues, and start to grow marijuana for public consumption. You know, obviously one of the first rules was because our neighbor to the south, it is not legal. U.S. cash is not They cannot use U.S. cash. If they're using a specific financial institution, whether it's a bank or credit union. One of the biggest issues that was caused by the legalization of marijuana, number one, the supply and demand issue was not properly dealt with. So we still saw organized crime supplying marijuana to certain parts of the Canadian market that was not subject to Health Canada requirements. But also with the legitimate marijuana growing companies, ultimate beneficial ownership of those companies became a real challenge. We saw organized crime groups 1 or 2 steps back from the money. We saw various people in law enforcement roles assuming corporate security positions within these companies. It became very diluted. It became very muddy right away. And banks and other financial institutions had to really dig deep to see, okay, who ultimately benefits from this company? Where is the money actually coming from? Are people being used as straw investors or buyers? There was a lot of issues. There's a lot of conflict of interest. And as law enforcement started to delve into this, they saw organized crime behind some of that legitimate industry. And from a regulatory standpoint, for financial institutions, that creates a lot of issues in terms of EDD and CDD work with high-risk clients, just to start the conversation.
Mm. And those are great points, Cam. And, at my credit union, we do bank, legal cannabis stores and legal cannabis growers. But the EDD is the enhanced due diligence on that for account opening and for ongoing monitoring is tough. I think what's happened over, it started off and everyone made money before cannabis became legal, right? And now it became legal and there's not a ton of money. You're going to see, I think, a merger of cannabis organizations across Canada as they try to realize that they can't make money on their own because they need to become one, because the volume of sales is not there. So from my experience, unless you have a big volume of sales, it's hard to hide dirty money if there's no clean money coming in. At least it's harder to do it. And the government does have pretty specific regulations on, control over inventory control and logging that financial institutions can see and should see to make sure that if I report $10,000 in marijuana sales during October, then I better have shown I bought $10,000 of marijuana from the government, right? And if I didn't, then where'd the marijuana come from? Because it could be coming in the back door from organized crime. So there is the ability. It's effort, right? It's effort, but it is a legal business in Canada. Whether you think it should be or not, it's legal. It's regulated. There's oversight. So I'm not a believer in refusing financial services for a legal business in Canada if you can find a risk mitigation strategy for it. And I'm hard pressed to not find a risk mitigation strategy. Sometimes that risk mitigation strategy is too expensive, right? So, okay, having oversight over business B is going to take us too much time and money to justify having business B on board. But I'm not scared of working with and finding ways to mitigate the risk of legal Canadian companies.
So it would be said that some institutions may shy away from it and not yes. on board those type of businesses. So I suppose that's part of an issue that could be difficult. Does that mean that it would cost more money for a business of such high risk to be entering into a financial institution? That they'd have less choice, I suppose.
It depends on where you go. Some companies will charge for that escrow risk. I know money service businesses, for instance, if you want to get an account, it costs you a lot of money. And because it's hard to find an account for an MSB, which is a legal regulated entity in Canada. And so the cannabis is getting better, right? At the beginning, it was hard because you had all these layers of oversight that financial institutions wanted was massive because it was brand new and scary. And we knew that the looming correspondent banking relationship with the US was right there to shut down our ability to move money. So we had to be very careful. I think it's not quite as onerous as it was. But there are or should be some extra account fees included for those more demanding businesses, whether it's a cash-based business like a restaurant or a coin-operated car wash or cannabis.
Yeah, sure.
What wrinkle has been thrown in there, if I can just interject, the U.S. federal government, I think, just introduced legislation to legalize marijuana in the United States to some way, shape, or form. And that will definitely have impacts on the Canadian cannabis industry as well, that it might actually allow for ease of banking. And as Dwayne said, this is a few years old now. Banks are actually getting better at assessing the risk, properly upsizing and upskilling their AML investigators to do better enhanced due diligence. So things are changing rapidly still. We'll see where it goes.
So you could almost say it's done them a favour because it's helped the world of AML to up stage. So in some respects, yeah. Which kind of brings me on to how does the risk of money laundering differ between some of these industries? We touched on the social media just now, but social media, crypto, and NFTs compared to more traditional sectors.
I mean, I said it. I'm going to say it again. We haven't got the traditional sector under control yet. Like NFTs, yes, okay, people are making, selling the funky monkey for $1 million gazillion, and it could have been proceeds of crime. But we haven't stopped art dealers from being able to sell. In Canada, an art dealer is not regulated as a reporting entity, and they are somewhere in the world. I can go buy a $200,000 Lamborghini. That's probably a cheap Lamborghini, but a $250,000 Lamborghini with cash, and the dealership's not a reporting entity. So, we've got a lot of loopholes. So I love to talk the new stuff like crypto, and I'm a fan of crypto, even though I've investigated as a police officer. I seized crypto that was being used to buy and sell drugs on the dark web. So I understand the dark side of crypto, but there was a EU study, and I can't remember which part of the EU did the study, and it was about 2018 or 2019. They tried to examine how much crypto is actually being used to launder and to purchase drugs in the EU. And they compared that against the total volume of drugs being purchased. And it was like a minuscule percentage. But all the training back then was all about crypto and money laundering. But, it represented a fraction of the actual money laundering that was occurring, and the drug sales are actually happening. So do we have to have our mind to it? Yes. Is it an issue? 100%. But if you think about the online illegal sales of cannabis, just through email money transfers in Canada is far greater than crypto. And you think now about the expansion of the iGaming space in our country and how much the millions upon millions of dollars that people are shifting through online gaming. When there's that much money flowing, you can easily hide criminal money in there. So I think we've got to figure out the gambling side before we start worrying about the others.
Yeah, I completely agree. Recently, and I think Dwayne was there as well, the Toronto Police Service hosted an International Financial Crime Investigators Conference, and it truly was international. And I have to say, I think at least 75% of the speakers reference, we still don't know how to deal with TBML, trade-based money laundering, which is like the oldest form of money laundering. It's been going on for centuries, and just coming up, we're just not doing it well. NFTs, you can buy some digital picture of a certain president's boot or something like that. I mean, that's great, but we just don't know how to handle TBML vis-a-vis drugs, stolen cars, you name it, and we're not successful. We're getting under 10% of anything. So we're just going to add it to the pile of deliverables that AML teams have to do. But the more senior leaders that you speak to in the AML space, like they're all the same opinion. We need to understand crypto. We need to understand the impacts of social media. We need to understand tumblers. We need to wrap our head around things like open banking. Even though they don't represent big parts of what we're doing yet, they're coming. And we really do need to fully understand and appreciate the impact, short-term, medium-term, and long-term.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's interesting because understanding what the market, what's moving in the field. Last week, it's slightly off topic, but it's on topic. So last week I was at an event that we're talking about AI. Now, AI can mean several things to several different people, and of course, the AML guys are going, "Well, can you explain to me what it means?" Suddenly you need someone to be able to understand what does that mean and what impact does it have. The sure thing is that the bad actors are going to be one step ahead of you, and in this case, they're going to be one step ahead of you. That's just the nature of it. So yeah, I'm talking about being one step ahead. FinTrack received over 31 million individual reports relating to money laundering in British Columbia. How do you think that the industry can better deal with that?
I'm going to take this first because because I like FinTrack. I think they have a good product. I think it's not perfect product, but I think they have a good product. And, I've used it to write warrants and kick in doors and arrest bad guys, like literally kick in doors and arrest bad guys based on the information I get from FinTrack. So you have to understand the regime in Canada to put context to the 31 million individual reports. I'll let Cam caveat how bad we're doing, but I'll have the positive and throw the negative back at you, Cam. Sorry, beer's on me later. But so of those 31 million, we are a transaction-based regime, right? So that includes, so if I may file 1,000 transactions in one suspicious transaction report. So that makes up part of that million. So it could be one report, but it could have 1,000 transactions in there. And you think about all the different reporting entities across the country that all have that same volume, and the big banks may do 3,000 or 4,000 transactions in one report. So and then you add all your large cash transaction reports, your electronic fund transfer reports, your gaming reports, your all the rest of the reports, cross-border currency. That 31 million sounds woo, but it's not really representative of specific intelligence. And I would like really the numbers to say, okay, what type of how many specific pieces of intelligence did FinTrack receive? And by intelligence, I mean words explaining the suspicion. Not all the 1,000 transactions that were supporting those words, but to give those words. How many times did FinTrack receive words? And then what did you do with those words? That I think would be a more genuine look at the numbers. Because we know, statistics are made up 77% of the time on the spot, and numbers can mean anything. You can change a number to whatever the report whatever the entity that's reporting it wants it to make. We've learned that from our politicians, right? You can report on the exact same budget statement 2 different ways. One sounds good, one sounds bad, but it's the same numbers. So I think there's got to be a caveat to those numbers, and I think for what the product that FinTrack report gives to law enforcement is a really good product. And I think that's what the message needs to be, not what happened to 31 million reports. Cam, over to you for the negative.
Yeah, no, and I'm going to start right away. We're in an STR regime in Canada where we file on transactions. Our neighbors to the south, FinCEN with U.S. Treasury, they're a suspicious activity reporting where they cluster transactions and file. I think most Canadian institutions, I'm just going to go out on a limb, would probably prefer a SAR regime, but the STR reporting mechanisms are so automated, it's not as big an issue as it would seem. Everything is filed automatically in most large financial institutions as if it were a SAR, and linking all the STRs. I don't think it's as big a deal as we think. A SAR regime would be better. One of the things that differentiates the Canadian and American programs is Canadian law enforcement cannot go into FinTrack's STR data. They don't have authorization. In the United States, certain officers and agents can access SAR data at FinCEN to kind of get their intelligence. But I too am generally a fairly big fan of FinTrack. Even through the COVID-19 pandemic, FinTrack has exponentially grown their disclosures to law enforcement of intelligence. And people say, well, 31 million STRs is coming out with only 1,500 law enforcement disclosures, but one disclosure could potentially have 200,000 or 300,000 STRs behind it. To Dwayne's point, the stats, you could argue the stats either way. In the Canadian regime, law enforcement is doing more proactive reach outs to FinTrack by way of, they call it a VERS, where they're actually disclosing their investigations to FinTrack and proactively getting intelligence from FinTrack. So we're seeing a lot of improvement, and even creating different laneways for STRs. It could be just a ho-hum, this is over $10,000 to something that affects national security. Those are talks that are ongoing right now with FinTrack and financial institutions. But the 31 million is kind of a deceiving total. There is a lot of great work being done within that. So,
and I just want to build on a little bit there, Cam, of what you said, because you really brought up an important point, and that is sort of the change in law enforcement's use of FinTrack over the years. There was a lot more reactive, proactive disclosure, where FinTrack would just send out a bunch of information to law enforcement. Well, and when I was a law enforcement officer, I received a disclosure from FinTrack all about this small convenience store in Toronto that was connected through their beneficial ownership to organized crime, like traditional organized crime. And the disclosures that came to me suggested that on their records, this convenience store was selling more cigarettes than the store could actually hold if you fill up the entire store with cigarettes. Like there wasn't enough square footage to hold the cigarettes. Well, that's a massive investigation. We're talking traditional organized crime. We're talking a massive investigation. We had 8 people in my unit. Like I'm not running that investigation. So FinTrack used to dump a lot of these proactive disclosures on law enforcement that went nowhere.
Yeah.
And so now what's happening a lot more is law enforcement saying, listen, we're looking at Cameron Field because we think he's a bad man. Tell us what you know about Cameron Field, because that's targeted intelligence now. Yeah. So when FinTrack gives all that information, they send it back a blank form because Cam's a great guy. Maybe law enforcement realizes they've got the wrong person. But that targeted use of intelligence driven by law enforcement is a far superior way than it was being done, and it's being done a lot more.
Yeah.
Is that what we're talking around with the persona? So the advancements in technology that FinTrack have, the impact on the detection and the prevention of that money laundering?
I think a lot of it is, I used to train law enforcement across this country on what FinTrack was. They didn't know how to fill out a form to get information from the government. Like there was the lack of knowledge, and the knowledge now has increased dramatically. FinTrack has changed their approach. They're a lot more open and accessible. Law enforcement's training is rolling out. So law enforcement starting to say, hey, every investigation, we should go to FinTrack. Every investigation that involves some sort of financial crime should go to FinTrack. And so that, I think it's been a change in education and openness from the government.
Yeah, and to build on Dwayne's point real quick, FinTrack has really done a lot of outreach, a lot more than they have. Right from the top to bottom, Sarah Paquette, the director of FinTrack, is on the lecture circuit nonstop. Dwayne and I bumped into her many times. And the fact that FinTrack is a checklist item for law enforcement goes a long, long way. And just a point, Dwayne and I, when we were in law enforcement, we saw some of the first law enforcement disclosures from FinTrack, and they were awful. The ones that they're doing now are incredibly comprehensive, complex. They're spot on intelligence, and they're basically laying all the breadcrumbs that law enforcement needs to operationalize some very large scale investigations into terrorist financing, terrorist resourcing, organized crime, and things like that. So definitely a lot of progress has been made.
Very good. Talking of such progress, it's a hot topic here, and I've been hearing it this morning at this particular event, and it's about sharing of information across different, not just jurisdictions, but of governing bodies. So it brings me to Canadians' project Athena. That's the public and the private partnership project. How do you think this has been successful in tackling money laundering?
I think I'll start first just explaining what public partnerships are in Canada, and then Cam will tackle the specifics. So a public-private partnership is, it's the bank. It's driven by the big 5 banks, and what they're doing, they are not, because we can't share information in Canada, right? I can't contact, if I'm TD Bank, Toronto Dominion Bank, I can't contact Bank of Montreal and say, listen, Dwayne's a money launderer, be worried. I can't have that free information sharing. So what these public-private partnerships are is that the banks have said, listen, okay, I'm going to now look at, in this, whatever it would be, the first one started off with human trafficking. And I'm going to develop a bunch of normal typologies and methodologies for money laundering. And I'm going to share those amongst our organizations. And our organizations are then going to specifically set up rules to find those red flags. And when we report on those rules, we're going to identify to FinTrack through a hashtag, Project Protect or whatever the project is. I'm going to identify this. This is one of these public-private partnerships. So it's not a specific information sharing. It's more like an intelligence sharing of how it's happening without the specific information behind who's doing it.
Yeah, and to build on Dwayne's point, I think Canada has, to the extent possible, perfected the public-private partnerships, or triple Ps as we call them. Specifically, Project Athena started in approximately 2018, and it was trying to deal with underground banking as it was being used to launder money from casino or through casinos in British Columbia, specifically the Lower Mainland. And the largest diaspora that was using it was high-value Chinese nationals that were living in the southern part of British Columbia. and using underground banking. As we know really quickly, in the People's Republic of China, they can only export $50,000 US out of China every year. So they use this underground banking network. And in typical Canadian fashion, our casinos were so ripe for disruption to allow for money laundering back in, anywhere from 2010 into 2018, where these threat actors would literally come to a casino with a hockey bag full of cash, which is how we launder money in Canada. It would have to be a hockey bag. And, cash in and just say, okay, you have $900,000 in chips. Well, it's just a card. They would go to a blackjack table, lose $20, come back and cash out. And that money's been laundered with a cashier check from the casino. Now, obviously, since Project Athena was started by Canada's federal law enforcement agency, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, casinos have really target hardened. It's hard to launder money through actual physical casinos in Canada now because of Athena. Athena, to build on Dwayne's point, it really allowed for the exchange of red flag indicators and typologies of money laundering in casinos, but also high value goods like cars, real estate, jewelry, and things like that, where we started to learn what that looked like and shared all of that intelligence except the personally identifiable information. Everything else is starting to be shared to the point now where there's a very well-organized thing called the Counter Illicit Finance Alliance of British Columbia, or as we call it, CIFA BC, that is now going to go Canada-wide, where everything but personal information is going to be shared, and banks can learn from the red flag indicators and typologies, as can credit unions, but also law enforcement can learn more about what that looks like and how they can better construct their investigations into high-value money laundering. So it's been a conditional success. I think there's still a long way to go.
And I think, Cam, it just as a big picture view of that one, right? When you turn on the lights, the cockroaches, you scatter and go hide, right? And in this analogy, the sharing of intelligence is turning on those lights. Yep. And that's why, I love working at a small mid-sized credit union, is because we know our members, right? If I go to sit in a branch and someone walks through the door, they know who that person is before they even walk up to the counter. And so that scares criminals. Because criminals they want to be part of some anonymous, they don't want to be part of some recognized organization. They want to be anonymous. And so the more we can turn on that intelligence, the more we can expose the cockroaches to the light, literally the criminal cockroaches, the better we do. But we're not quite there yet with full information sharing like they have in the US. I want to get there. We may not. But we're finding workarounds, right? We're not just saying there's a problem. Oh, well, we're saying there's a problem, but let's find a solution. We found a pretty good one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that we talk about cross-border from you to the US. I suppose, in what ways do international regulatory frameworks and cross-border transactions, they complicate the money laundering compliance efforts for businesses operating globally? What's your thoughts on that?
Sounds like a hard one, Cam. You feel that first. I'll think on it.
I'll grab that one because it's not really good news. So in terms of privacy laws, Canada probably has some of the strictest privacy laws globally. I think we're all aware of the GDPR laws that came into effect. I think it was June of 2018. GDPR laws should scare every financial institution and corporation within the EU. The United States, in terms of privacy, it's kind of a patchwork. I don't think there's a lot of privacy in the States. Since 9/11, obviously, we're all in our area. We're very much aware of the U.S. Patriot Act 314A and B, where financial institutions, if they're finding certain activities, as long as they file a SAR with FinCEN, they can talk to other banks. They can talk to peer banks. Generally, I think in the last few years, and Dwayne, I don't know if this is your kind of feedback as well, U.S. banks are not using 314B as much, but they can certainly exchange personally identifiable information a lot better than Canadian banks. There are a few carve-outs between Canadian banks where they can, in a very limited way, in a very, very non-efficient way, share limited information. But in terms of staying ahead of criminal elements, threat actors, large-scale financial crime shops, Canadian financial institutions' inability to share that information with each other and law enforcement is definitely one of the best things that criminal groups could hear. And it really is limiting what I would call real-time data and intelligence. to do that. I mean, you can have all the amazing AI capabilities, machine learning, robotics in every financial institution. That inability to share personally identifiable information is going to be a massive wall to really get the best intelligence to the people that need it most.
And just to give, because I know we've got a global audience here, and to give them some context behind, the strictness of our privacy. When I was a police officer, I had arrested someone who was, it was literally the first arrest and seizure of cryptocurrency in Canada, and I wanted to do up a press release. So typically what happens, you do up a press release, the banks then have adverse media screening, they pull that name, they say, okay, listen, Dwayne King's been arrested, let's see if he's a member of our bank, boom. But our, the public relations at Toronto Police didn't think this was press release worthy. So I phoned the 5 big banks and said, listen, just so you know, I gave them I'm going to call it a private press release. I didn't ask them anything. I just said, here's what I did yesterday. Have a nice day, and hung up the phone. That very quickly was criticized as almost as though I'm leading the banks in investigations. I'm giving the bank information. I said, but I can do a press release. It's different. I will never understand completely why it's different, because I didn't ask for anything. It was literally a one-way conversation. Now, we did get some great intelligence as a result of those phone calls, but then the ability to make those phone calls stop, because it was outside of that. It was too specific to that sharing that information. So that's sort of where we sit in the regime in Canada. But when I look at this question, I see it from a AML compliant, because on the CAMLO here at the credit union is understanding source of funds outside of Canada is darn near impossible, right? And seeing money coming in from offshore, our ability is limited to open source. And at that, that's it. We got some open source. We have source of funds in our wires, and we ask questions, but really our ability to understand if ABC 123 Inc., who just sent, $100,000 in for goods received, we can't really find what they do. We can't find their legitimacy. We can't. So anything coming in from offshore is very tough to investigate, very tough to really understand if that business is operating legally. And so it presents a massive issue from an investigative standpoint. Anytime you leave the walls of Canada, I don't call them walls, I'm going to call it a very short hedge, because we don't really have, we rely on the US a lot to form our walls. We got a short hedge. So once you leave the short hedge of Canada, it's really tough for us to figure out what's happening and why it's happening, unless we reach out to the customer and ask why it's happening, which is great. But if I ask an organized crime group why are they doing it, they're not going to tell me it's to supply half a key of Coke. They're going to say it was business related, right? So I'm not sure how much asking a criminal what they're doing is really helping.
If I can just do a quick bookend there, and just building on what Dwayne said, we're seeing a lot more and more in Canada of law enforcement doing proactive disclosures to the banking community, where they're actually getting the AML teams in one audience and laying out in a fairly discreet format that they're doing large money laundering investigations. And during Project Collector was one of them, where law enforcement proactively engaged banks and said, look, we're just going to tell you what we have. We're going to tell you who the players are. And then we're going to shut our screens. We're going to go home, and you do with it whatever you want. And it really, we're starting to see signs of established frameworks like the Gimlet in the United Kingdom, where law enforcement and banks work very closely together, probably not as much as they used to with regulatory kind of look and capability. But, in the Gimlet format, whatever bank has the largest exposure generally will, get all the bank's information and let law enforcement know how bad it is, what that looks like. So, where there's darkness, banks and law enforcement will find a little area of light and share where they can. So, more to follow, more chapters to come.
Yeah, you've actually taken a question out of my lips, to be honest, because that was exactly what I was going to ask Dwayne. So, as a leading financial crimes investigator for Mass Casualty Commission, how can business collaborate? And I think you've done that. I don't know if you want to expand a bit more, collaborate with law enforcement agencies and financial intelligence to combat it. I think you've kind of covered that.
Yeah, and my year on the Mass Casualty Commission was quite an interesting look. For those that are not aware, April 18th and 19th, 2020, an individual, I'm not going to dignify him with a name, killed over 20 people in rural Nova Scotia. From rural Nova Scotia, we're talking towns, communities, if you will, that may have a population of 20 or 30, and 12 or 13 of them were wiped out. And he went on this rampage driving what looked as though it was a fully marked RCMP scout car. And so the federal, provincial governments, mass casualty shootings like this and mass casualty events in Canada are rare. That's how we very much differ from our brethren to the south. And so they pulled together this commission of inquiry, and always brought in to look at the financial aspect. Did finances play a role? How was he able to outfit this car? Was he laundering money to make this happen? Could our financial, or should our financial intelligence systems in Canada have caught this before it happened? Which is a great exploration. It turns out no. Sometimes just crazy, and you can't plan for crazy, right? You just can't. Like, sometimes stuff just happens, and there's no predetermining factors to what's happening. And nothing he was doing was illegal on its face. The only sort of piece that I pulled away from that was that social economic status played a role. He was a very successful practitioner in Nova Scotia. He was making what, from a Nova Scotia perspective, was a higher income. He was very generous with his income. And as a result, he had respect from people in the community. And as a result, no one reported him building this police car, having all these firearms that were illegally obtained, and practicing them in the back 40 of his cottage. Now, if it was a young black male in low-income housing, Nova Scotia, building a police car in the parking lot, someone would have called the police. So I think social economic status played a role, but it wasn't financial crime. It wasn't anything that our financial crime system should or could have captured.
Yeah. Sorry, if I could just add a note. I actually come from Nova Scotia, and I know when Dwayne was picked as leading investigations, I actually told him this is personal. It affected Nova Scotia. They're still suffering to this day, and Canada-wide. But Dwayne brings up a really good point about, can we interdict in situations like this? I know when the Las Vegas shooter did his thing in Las Vegas years ago during a country music concert, the FBI did a forensic analysis of his finances, and it was so subtle they never could have planned for this in terms of how he perpetrated that crime. That was definitely the finding of the Mass Casualty Commission, as Dwayne said, but yeah, it really does kind of accentuate our limitations in certain cases of horrible things going wrong. So,
and if I can just jump on a soapbox for just a minute, and I hate doing that, but what there has not been is a global examination of mass casualty events to determine if there is a pattern that's not visible by looking at one. Is there, because if you look at 1 or 2 or 10, you may not see patterns, but is there financial patterns that existed in the financials of these perpetrators? That's the question we need to examine globally. Yes, the US did Las Vegas. Yes, I read that report when I did Nova Scotia, but they weren't connected. There hasn't been a global, and why not? Thousands of people are being murdered, innocent people are being killed. If there is a financial way, and now that we have our artificial intelligence to bring it all together and dissect that information, why aren't we using it? Why there's a global approach to, well, because privacy kicks in, right? Oh, it's privacy, good. Let's people get killed because of privacy. Anyways, I'll throw my soapbox away and come back down. But that's my level of frustration, as you can see.
I'll just extract the soapbox slightly and just say that I've taken it from a retail shop and I've bought it. And not only did I buy the soapbox, I bought some polythene, I bought a spade, and I bought some duct tape. Now, you would think those three things, and I actually did buy those things not recently. And my daughter said to me, she's 17 and quite into crime stuff, and she says, "It looks like you're going to murder someone." Now, my point to this is there becomes a red flag, but a red flag at such low level that would it get detected? Maybe it would get detected at the little hardware store when little mums and pups go, well, that's a bit of a strange purchase. Maybe it would. But my point to that is, where does this start? Education is the key part here. But education is not just for, dare I say, for experts like yourselves. Education is for the public too, to say, let's be aware of what's going on, no matter what it is.
That's a great point, Mark. And I don't want to rip this away from where we're going, but I was traveling down to Florida just pre-COVID, and I was traveling on a cruise, and it was Super Bowl weekend. And I was at the airport in Fort Lauderdale, and every 15 minutes they had an announcement about human trafficking. Two things. It's disgusting to have an announcement every 15 minutes because it's Super Bowl, and I guess it's okay to traffic people over Super Bowl weekend. But the fact that we're now aware, right? We're now aware. We're educating anyone who's at the airport every 15 minutes. They heard an announcement about human trafficking. So that's exactly what you're talking about. And I think it's great. I think it's sad that we need it, but I think education of not just law enforcement professionals, not just financial institutions, reporting entities, but you can launder money through any organization in this country that moves money. So pretty much you can launder money through anything in this country or globally. It doesn't have to be, it's not specific to Canada. So educating the population at large is a really important piece. And I told you I wasn't going to get the soapbox back, but I will for a second. During COVID, we managed to get, 90% of our population vaccinated in a very short period of time. But for some reason, we can't get the anti-fraud message out to 91% of our population. So seniors are being defrauded every day. So we can't get the message out. How about someone at the government have a good thought? Every time you go in for a vaccination, you get a pamphlet on fraud. Right? I mean, it just seems such a simple thing to do, to leverage two things and have that connection, because you need the education to stop the fraud, stop the financial crime, stop the human trafficking. You need the education. But how do you hit all the people? Well, they had a great opportunity to hit all the people because they literally were sticking them with needles. Yep. Sorry, I broke the soapbox now. It won't happen again.
Fantastic. Well, I'm conscious of time, and we're coming to a close shortly. But what I want to do is give you both an opportunity to sort of answer this question, and I'll start with you, Cameron. So, given your breadth of knowledge of the experience, and it looks like we have a question just popped up right in front of me. Look at that. Can you read that as well as I can?
Yes, sir.
Leah has taken these words from me. So am I going to read it out? So I think the disconnect between Canadian systems sharing information, including gaining intelligence that be shared from a social status, even family courts could be shared more to prevent serious crimes, including financial crime. What's your thoughts?
That's a really good question. And this actually is a really good example of kind of the disparate nature of intelligence sources throughout Canada. A lot of people, like within the Canadian judicial system, unless there's some kind of a sealing order from a judge, when people are charged, when search warrants are approved, unless there's a specific move to keep them from public view, all that information is available. You can go into a courthouse, pay $20, and get the indictment or the search warrant. Leah, really touches on a really interesting point where there's such a vast amount of intelligence within our court system, but then in any other Western country or any country globally, there's different types of courts. You have family courts, you have labor courts, you have a small claims court, you have like a smaller offenses court, then you have your criminal courts. And there's no connection between any of those courts that would flow obviously into police intelligence or FinTrack intelligence or even national intelligence and things like that. And from social perspectives, I mean, you're going to see things like human trafficking come out of that, family orders that force people to actually pay money to support their families, things like that, where which makes people vulnerable to things like human trafficking. I mean, what we need is there. We just don't know how to extract it and to create privacy laws that are more sensitive and more efficient to allow people that are in places to affect change, like law enforcement, like FinTrack, like financial institutions, to better kind of do their job. And I think it also comes down to capacity. I mean, do we really have the people in place to deal with that? But there are people suffering because we are not sharing intelligence the way we need to.
And thanks for the question, Leah. I'm a fan on LinkedIn, so I'm glad you jumped on board and are listening. If you think about, the Mass Casualty Commission looked at intimate partner violence and financial control as part of that intimate partner violence. And so we think about financial crime from stop money laundering, stop fraud, but what about, the financial intelligence that will help identify when someone may be financially controlling an individual? whether it's a human trafficking financial control or whether it's an intimate partner violence type of financial control. I think it's possible. I think in a utopian, in my perfect world, if I had the magic wand, I think we could do so much with financial intelligence to even understand not just financial crime, but lots of other crime. We know that data drives so much. When I'm walking through the mall and I connect to the mall's Wi-Fi, they know where I'm going, how much time I spent in each store, what I bought at the food court. They know everything about me because data is so intelligent for a marketing perspective, from a business perspective. Well, no different than understanding financials from a preventing a lot of different types of crime perspective. So I think it does have a possibility. I just don't think right now there's the capacity, the will, or maybe even the technology to make it happen.
I think Leah is got you both actually, because she's about to post another question, I believe. There we go. We've got her. You've got hooked. You've got a fan. Thanks for your comments. Bring the correctional problem. Yep, I think you can read that yourselves, can't you guys? Mm-hmm. I think you can see that.
Yeah. I can't. I mean, my wife is a probation officer, just retired in October. I don't want to speak to our probation system except to say it's broken. Our correction system is broken. We are letting criminals out. It's almost a reverse onus now, which means you get let out until I can convince someone you should stay. So you get let out, and then when you finally kill someone else, because the first person you killed wasn't enough, or the first time you beat your partner wasn't enough, you got to beat them again, and then we'll keep you. So I think that our correctional probation system is broken, not from the working people that are boots in the ground trying their damnedest to get it to work. It's our government's failure. Yeah, I'm looking right at you, government. Our government failure to have proper laws in place.
Yeah. This also speaks to an issue, and Leah brings this up. Corrections Canada and the provincial corrections teams. I mean, prisoner finances are always a big deal. Inmates can still function quite well while they're in like secure custody. They still have bank accounts. They have access to people. They can phone people. They can move money on a phone call. And, I think this really highlights a point that we're not monitoring it enough, and these offenders can offend from inside jail. It's nothing new in Canada or anywhere else in the world, and in some countries their prisons resemble country clubs. Canada's, Dwayne, you and I have been in prisons to interview people, but they still have a lot of autonomy, and they can abuse and target victims from inside jail, and there's very little visibility for that for agencies like FinTrack, Finance Canada, and law enforcement. So it's a really good point. Yeah,
I think it's a much deeper social problem. I think personally, even yesterday on the BBC News, they announced that our Prime Minister was going to delay some of the prosecutions in the UK because the prisons are too full. So there lies really a moral status of what you should or shouldn't do. But we've got completely off the topic. But it's interesting that you should say that within the prisons they can still control money. They can still control some of those points, which they're the masterminds behind it. And of course, if you was unfortunate enough to be put into prison for a misdemeanor, you might come out much more educated in the wrong side of the world than you should be on the inside of the world. So that's a whole different subject. But yes. I think we're coming to the end. From final comments from you guys, it's been absolutely fabulous to hear your font of knowledge. I could chat with you for ages, and I know it's only 12 o'clock midday with you there, but it's for me here it's the beer o'clock. So not that I want to go, but there you go. That's another subject. So final statement. We're talking about the hot topic that we were talking about earlier. Have you got any sort of words of wisdom that you could pass on to your fellow guys within this changing traditional to modern AML combats, I suppose?
Dwayne, I'll fire off. I'm going to do this real quick. I'm a data evangelist. I think we need to look at financial crime differently. I think we need to look at it as a hermetically sealed ecosystem from the digital beginnings of financial crime or any of the other predicate offenses, where we can start sharing things like artifacts, like cell phone numbers, IP addresses, emails. It doesn't matter. But look at it in its entirety, from the beginnings in the digital world to the actual fraud, financial crime, to the downstream money laundering. We have to look at it from an entire ecosystem, not just focus on the fraud or the money laundering. I think if we're going to have any wins here, we have to aggregate our data and exploit and extract that intelligence as soon as we can. And we're nowhere near that.
And I'm going to be very, very political and not answer the question at all, and just say that, you know, to the financial investigators that are out there, the work you're doing makes a difference. So don't stop doing it because there's problems with the system. If the boat has a hole, don't stop bailing it just because it's got a hole in it. You're keeping it alive with the work you're doing. So don't think for a second it doesn't have meaning, because it does. Because Cam and I have used it to put bad people in jail. That's what I want to leave everyone who's listening out there who's an actual AML practitioner. Don't stop doing what you're doing just because the system's got some holes in it.
Very good point. Very good, guys. Been an absolute pleasure. Can I just ask you guys to stay on whilst we finish this session? But thank you very much, everyone, and to the audience. And it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers all.
Well, there you go.